This is the grand question and answer session led by you and led by you in the satellite locations. Let's give this a shot. Who's got a question for our people with a microphone? Okay, so there's a hand up, dead center of the Camden Auditorium. Sir, tell us your name and...
Tony Grassi from Camden, and my question is for Kathleen Hall-Jamieson. Given the importance of the debates, you cited 64 million viewers, what can we do to improve the questions from the moderators, which just play into all the bad dialogue, not into the substance?
We organized a debate reform commission before the last election of the people who had participated in handling the candidates. I put handling in quotation marks over the past election seasons, both Republicans and Democrats equally balanced, and asked how could we increase the likelihood that the debates served the electorate well. And one of the things that we recommended was that each candidate be able to tee up a certain number of topics to be addressed, so that you guarantee that if there's something that's really important to you, you've got to say it, but also if there's something really important that your opponent wanted to say, they would say it. One of the problems with the question structures is whole sets of questions that are very important to the candidates don't ever get exposed for the mass exposure for the electorate. So if there were one change that I were going to make in the questioning, it would be to implement that change.
Were you loving the questions at the very last debate?
No.
There's a question over here, and the microphone's coming. Sir, your name?
Barry Jackson, Saco, Maine. When I'm looking at the beautiful production cameras and talented cameramen here, I'm reminded that 30 years ago or so, there was an economic barrier or gateway to journalism that we don't have today. So I'm wondering, now that we have the democratization of digital media, anyone with an iPhone is a content producer. How do you think that this affects the present and the future of your profession?
Jeff, maybe?
Jeff, probably.
Well, I'm going to celebrate that because I think it goes back to the pre-Gutenberg age of us all having that conversation. And as I was doing my research on the Reformation, I'm up to about there. I'm up to about 1517, 1520. Luther and the super salesman of indulgences used the press to enter into a public dialogue, back and forth and back and forth. Luther could have done this in a disputation. He could have done it in Latin. No one would have seen. We don't know whether he actually posted them on the door. Didn't matter, because what he posted it to was the press. And what struck me was that we've gotten so much into this idea that there's this finished product called content. At the time, it was dialogue. And I think that's what's starting to happen again, and we don't know how to do it. We have no idea how to have a public conversation. We're very bad at it. We're yelling at each other. We're getting out centuries of anger. But I have faith in my fellow men and women that we will figure it out. I think Maria has a different experience in her land, which I respect greatly and respect the differences greatly. But I remain an optimist to a fault that hearing more voices that have always been there will end up for the good. And the smart journalists realize that they have these tools. This is why I started a degree in social journalism, so that people in those programs do not start with content. They start with the community. They observe, listen to, reflect, empathize with the community, understand that community's needs, and then bring back journalism of all kinds of new forms that I never would have imagined. So the tools that we have enable this conversation in new ways. And if we don't believe in that conversation fundamentally, then I don't think we can believe in democracy, free markets, reform, religion, education, or any of that good stuff.
This is a fundamental issue that you brought up. I'd like more of the panel to weigh in. Maria, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
She's doing journalism.
Streamer in chief.
As both
a Rappler
media manager and camera person.
So I think that in the old marketplace of ideas, when the public sphere existed, it took us centuries to get to where we were. And then we were disrupted by technology. And the rules of the old marketplace of ideas don't work anymore, and the rules, in quotes, that exist today do not work. And so we are at this place where I'm a big proponent of free speech. I'm a journalist, right? But at the same time, what we have seen, especially in countries in the global south, is when you pump lies into the system and when you create a system that is meant to manipulate our behavior, you get very bad results. So I think all I'm saying now is we are where we are today. It requires a lot of us to think it through. And I guess I'll jump off the plutonium, and this is the last point. Data is not the new oil, it's plutonium. It's like an atom bomb went off in our information ecosystem. And like post-World War II, the whole world came together and we came up with Bretton Woods, NATO, with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, agreements globally that are meant to protect the human nature from the worst of human nature. I think we need that for our information ecosystem today.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, in my talk, I mentioned that I think, the smartphone and social media together have obviously changed a lot of things, but I don't think they've changed everything. So, they've atomized things. They've also opened up to new voices. They brought us fresh perspectives, more diversity, and all the rest of it. And they've definitely, affected that journalist gatekeeper role. They've affected the confidence of journalism as well. But it's different in different countries. In some countries where institutions are weaker, those effects have been much more damaging in many cases. In other places where the institutions are stronger, actually the gatekeeper effect is still quite strong. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that. I always think about this as an and world. It's not like this has completely replaced what happened before. It's kind of layered on top of it. And I'm actually seeing a bit of a return to the finished product. So I think the finished product is here to stay. Some people will still buy newspapers. Podcasts are effectively a return to people wanting something that is crafted and finished and produced by professionals. So I like the future, which is a combination of those two things, the extra diversity and choice that we have, plus the professionalism and somebody who's really thought about something and packaged it really well. I think the tricky thing is, we're still trying to work out how all this fits together.
Josh, and then I'm very interested in what Courtney has to say.
So while I'm very sympathetic to some of the issues that Maria's raised about the information overload and what happens when anyone can pump information into the news feeds that we have, I think it's really important to keep a sort of global perspective on this. And in the United States, we can look back longingly at Walter Cronkite as a gatekeeper for what was appropriate news, although it should be pointed out, again, those were all older white men who were filling the roles of gatekeepers at that point in time. But in other countries, the gatekeepers are going to do things because they don't want the population to have knowledge. And this has been long been the story of democratization, is how people who want to push for more democratic, open societies deal with societies that have ingrained censorship. And I think the citizen journalist here can play a huge role in this. And if we think back to some of the early instances where we begin thinking about social media and political participation, right, we go to Gezi Park in Turkey. And famously, what happened in Gezi Park was that while the protests first started in Gezi Park, the Turkish CNN Turkey, or whatever it was, the national Turkish radio, was showing a documentary about penguins. Right? And what was happening at the same time was that people who were in Gezi Park were taking pictures with their phones and they were tweeting them and they were putting it online. And this gets back to the sort of hybrid model, because then this gets picked up by CNN International and you get these great pictures which then circulate on Twitter of split screens of CNN International showing the protests in Turkey and Turkish television showing penguins. And then the Turkish protesters adopt the penguin as their symbol and it gets spray painted all over Istanbul, and then people tweet anytime they see a penguin. So these are hybrid models, right? These are hybrid models that work in really important ways. If we think about, and then these also get, of course, as we go into the surveillance state and we go into facial recognition and things like that, we now have to revisit some of these questions again. But I think it's really important that when we consider these questions, we think about the global context in which they're taking place, not just the U.S. context.
Courtney?
Yeah, so In my other life, when I'm not doing advocacy for CPJ, I am an academic, and my book, which was based on my doctoral research in Egypt, is called Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism. And I think that we have to, your question was about journalism, and I think we have to think about what distinguishes journalism from other forms of content or media. There's something special about journalism, and it is also different from being a source. Somebody put up, the tweet from Abbottabad. That's an observation. For me, I look at that and I don't say that's journalism. That is an observation. That can be fodder for journalism. But I think we actually do journalism a disservice if we say that anyone who has an observation is doing journalism. There is some sort of intent when you're doing journalism. It means that you're trying to be factual. You're trying for some sort of balance. Where that balance takes place is going to be very different if you're an Egyptian blogger documenting police violence, but you're doing it in a way where you're trying to do it journalistically, versus if you're doing it for more activism. And that's hard to do, but we actually do it every day at CPJ when we're looking at cases of journalists who are killed, imprisoned, or attacked for their work, and trying to figure out, was it journalism? Was it media activism? It's not easy. And I mean, Yegi is the one looking, for example, at all of the cases in Iran. But I think we really have to think about what makes something journalism, because journalism and press freedom is something very important. It's in the First Amendment. It is protected under international law. It's not just content. But I do think that the future of journalism is very challenging, because those citizen journalists, unlike when I was writing in 2008 and 2011 with the Arab uprisings, and there were all these different platforms, and you had the amplification by the global media, now you have a few key platforms that determine, as you've heard throughout the weekend, visibility. And what we've seen, for example, with citizen journalism in Syria is it's getting taken off of the platforms because it's being equated with terrorist content. So there were hundreds of thousands of videos by citizen journalists and by Syrian media outlets that are working under very dangerous conditions, whose content videos were removed because they were terrorism. So we're also there in a very imbalanced situation. If you're spending money on SEO, search engine optimization, or figuring out how to game the Facebook algorithm, that's money and time you're not spending doing journalism.
And I was struck, Courtney, but also Yegi, Jason, maybe even Lydia, when the question was asked. Courtney, you made some comments yesterday about when the going gets tough, I'm pointing to Jason. Having an institution behind you that will support your journalism may be necessary, that a citizen journalist working alone or in a small team may not have. There was many things Jason pointed out yesterday that led to him being here with us today, family, but also you had quite a powerful institution behind you. And on some of the toughest stories, you're gonna have to be more than just brave to get those stories out, and that requires sometimes an apparatus that's bigger than what a citizen journalist has. Comments on that? Might be on.
Do I have to push anything? To the folks over here, I'm here, so. I can't see you, you can't see me, but I'm
But
here.
they have a great view there, Jason.
There might be a mirror somewhere. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge component in situations like that. And even still, it took 1.5 years to get me out. And I think powerful organizations are one thing, but to go back to a little bit of what we were talking about in relation to Iran specifically and other authoritarian countries that Yegi and I know in the Middle East, these regimes are having their cake and eating it too, right? They have access to all of these platforms, and they block their citizens from using them, right? So it's really a losing battle right now for a lot of people in the global South, but also all over the Middle East, when they're trying to get these stories out. Gezi Park is an interesting example, because Turkey was a fairly free media landscape, right? Saudi Arabia and Iran have never been free media landscapes. These are closed societies where the information circulating on the street level is, the regimes are constantly trying to suppress that getting out. And at the same time, every one of these countries has leadership who are, have massive Twitter followings, massive YouTube, Instagram followings. And I think we're very far from figuring out the answer to this particular part of the problem in that part of the world.
I just wanted to add that by my work at CPJ, just documenting the cases, almost all forms of media in the Middle East is state-run, government-owned. So if it is not for citizen journalists and whatever content, I understand sometimes the content have more activism flow to them, or they are mixed with other kinds of materials. But if it is not for citizen journalism, we sitting here in Camden, United States, would never find out what is happening right now in Syria, in Iran, in Saudi, in sometimes even Egypt, which seems like a little bit more open than the rest of the Middle East. But Maria Ressa showed a very amazing video at the end of her speech yesterday, and I commented on that last night to her that I talked to journalists who have similar answers to those questions, but because they all work for state government-owned organizations in Iran, they won't even be able to sit in front of those cameras and say they have been threatened by rape or death. So citizen journalism is a new form of journalism. It may not be at its best point yet, but we owe part of the knowledge that we get these days definitely from those people who are just willing to stand up and sacrifice and put themselves at risk.
Can I just also say, because we are here and because we talk about you have Jason who had the institution behind him, there is a journalist who is going on trial in his last appeal. The UN has called for his release. He is being imprisoned because he documented police violence. His name is Azamjam. I have some newspapers about him. His trial is on the 25th. So look into his case.
Where is he?
And sorry, Kyrgyzstan. And this is his last chance. My colleague was in Kyrgyzstan meeting with his family to provide support, but that's the sort of journalist where, thank God there are institutions like CPJ because, he doesn't have anyone putting attention on him. So please look into his case, tweet about it, or Facebook. Maybe we can have an impact.
I want to say one more thing on that. The Washington Post, following the horrific murder of my colleague Jamal Khashoggi, in coordination with CPJ and several of the other leading press freedom organizations, started what we call the Press Freedom Partnership. And we hold events, we coordinate with each other. This is really the first time that a news organization has done something like this. I mean, the space that CPJ and Reporters Without Borders and other groups work in has always been sort of separated from newsrooms. Newsrooms have a kind of a fear of activism, right? That's shifting, especially when it comes to our field. And I just want to mention that in coordination with these other groups, the Post has started a free monthly newsletter about press freedom issues around the world. If you go to WashingtonPost.com, you don't have to have a subscription or anything, but you can sign up for this newsletter, the Washington Post Press Freedom Newsletter, and be updated about these cases that are happening around the world. And there's lots of them. And some of them right here in the United States, but in every corner of the globe, we're dealing with these issues right now.
And I want to add one more thing. Sorry. We are advocates for journalists. I have to mention, please, a great example of one of these amazing citizen journalists who was a freelance journalist and went to Syria to bring us news about Syria is Austin Tice. He's missing in Syria for 8 years. It's on All Americans. He's missing in Syria. It's on All Americans to demand, write to your governor, to your congressperson, to your senator. And his family is desperate. They have been looking for him everywhere. They have never received the clear, credible answer from the Syrian government. It is believed that he's taken by pro-Assad militia, but we don't know anything. Please help his family in their effort to end their plight and bring their son home. Austin Tice, you can see #free Austin Tice on social media and austintice.org, and be the family's voice.
Austin Tice. Question from the Camden balcony.
My name is Giacomo Pellizzari. I'm from Italy, and I'm here with Watershed School. And my question is to Joshua Tucker.
Yeah, we're right. Oh.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What are the tools that my generation has to use now and in the future to fight fake news?
That's to me. All right. I mean, I think everything that is going on around, I made a little bit of light of this yesterday when we were talking, but it is a serious time. I mean, I think the move towards putting digital literacy training into school curricula is a fantastic idea, and it's something that we should be advancing, we should be thinking about, and there's a lot of people doing, I think, really good work at ed schools and at the intersection of education schools and technology programs and data science programs. This is part of a much bigger conversation around things like how to talk about AI, how to learn about biases that exist in AI. There's a lot of, I think, interesting cutting edge work and thinking about this, right? Moving from the fact of thinking of machine learning and these sorts of things as just, well, these are machines, so they're not biased, to understanding what sort of biases are out there. So I think anything that helps understanding the sort of new digital information environment that we're in. Other than that, the things that any generation can do, I think, to deal with this question of disinformation, to deal with this question of kind of online propaganda, is trying to figure out how to strike the right balance between being vigilant, but not being non-receptive to information that doesn't go along with your political proclivities, right? The danger of disinformation, the danger to me, I think at this moment in time, and these things can change and they vary across different countries, but I'm more concerned about what I would call the indirect effects of disinformation on the way citizens think about politics than the direct effects. I think everything that we've done, I talked about this yesterday in my talk, so much of what we do in this world is this kind of power law, where small numbers of people are getting large amounts of exposure, and lots of people are not getting that much exposure. For most people in 2016, most of what they saw online was legitimate news from legitimate news sources. That doesn't mean that most, the economists Hunt Alcott at NYU and Matt Genskow at Stanford estimated that the average American saw 1.2 of these, what are we supposed to call them now?
Instances of viral deception.
No, the other one. The first
Imposter
one.
news.
Imposter news.
Imposter news. They saw like 1.2 of these imposter news stories, right? That's not, and they saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of true news stories over the course of the campaign. However, lots of people are now talking about the fact that when we look and when we consume news, we have to worry about disinformation. We have to worry about the prevalence of disinformation. And I'm not saying we shouldn't worry about the prevalence of disinformation, but that creates openings for people to weaponize this idea that there is this imposter news, or weaponize it using the term that the politicians use, which is to say that news that is unflattering to me must be considered fake news. It's not real news. And this indirect effect undermines confidence in a free press, and confidence in a free press is what we need to hold leaders accountable. So I think we need to begin to think about, we as researchers need to be able to tell you, the mass public, more about what are the trade-offs between training an informed citizenry to be vigilant and to be skeptical of news versus creating a citizenry that's skeptical of news, right? And we need to be thinking about this question. But I think you, as the students and as people who are going to be future leaders in this country, I think you need to be thinking both about this kind of climate, about how do we restore trust in mainstream media? How do we restore trust in the fact that, how do we counter attacks when leaders try to weaponize this concept that there is disinformation out there to call into question legitimate news and legitimate and factually based news reporting. And I think what you can do as a younger generation is be aware that these things are happening simultaneously and be aware of your own biases, right? And I showed that fact yesterday. When we went out to the mass public, right, we found that conservatives were really decent at flagging liberal-based fake news, but they were not decent at flagging fake news or imposter news or or false or misleading news in that study. False or misleading news, they weren't good at flagging it when it conformed with their own political proclivities. And I think being skeptical of things that make you feel good because they conform with your political proclivities, when they come from a source that you don't recognize, when it's just thrown out as a rumor, try to treat it the same way as you would something that cut against your political proclivities. And I think that will be an important step forward.
You know, imposter news, but I like VD.
Okay, I've got my soundbite now. David Pancaccio publicly stated, I like VD.
Take that out of context.
Yeah, right out of context. It would only be fair if that happened to me. We have a question from one of our partner locations, from Rockland, up the coast here. Given the demise of local and some major newspapers, what are the career prospects and opportunities for journalists? I'm going to assign that one to the person who raises their hand. We'll start with Courtney, and then we're going to go to Jeff.
Yeah, just briefly, you can do journalism in a lot of different ways. I worked, for the New York Times and LRB as like a straightforward journalist, but now I work for an advocacy organization doing journalism, using journalism to help journalists. There are many ways and places to do journalism. It doesn't just have to be at a straightforward news outlet.
Jeff?
Our graduates at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York, with a great year-and-a-half program, are getting jobs. It's not easy. It's not an easy living. It's difficult. But there are all kinds of new jobs, and we're going to concentrate more in the future on training people not just for jobs but for work. Those are the words of my dean, Sarah Bartlett, where the independent, resilient journalist can now make a living of sorts, starting on YouTube and Medium and Kickstarter and Patreon. And so we need to prepare people for new ways to do this work and fill in the many deserts that exist in news coverage.
And as journalists, reporters, was the way the question was asked, and you think of ink-stained wretches and people actually out there writing the story, but there's a blossoming of multimedia, and some of that is journalism, and that requires all these other people to do the audio or to be the online video editor to help put together the news. And I'm seeing it's so different from just a few years ago when you would. It seemed like a completely dead profession, at least if you talk to the print people.
And building off of that point, I think one thing that students can do who are considering going into journalism is train themselves in data science skills as well. Increasingly, reporting is going to involve digging into large data sets, as the way people have talked about here. It's also that's also a skill that's valued widely in the workplace, and so I think you can pursue that as part of your journalism training with a good sense that that's also like providing you with skills that will be useful if you decide you take careers in other directions too. But I think that's one piece of advice I would offer.
Got on this side, there's a question.
Yeah, my name is Kenny Nelson, and I'm from Falmouth, Maine. And this is for Kathleen Jameson. If we accept Russian disruption of our elections as a fact of life, what will stop Putin from disrupting our banking systems, our stock reporting systems, our credit cards, our court reporting of cases systems that would result in a total disruption of the ordinary lives of ordinary Americans by the hundreds of millions? Thank you.
I think we make a mistake if we frame this solely in terms of Russia. There are threats from other nation states that are as real. When one crosses the line into disrupting things such as our financial system, one crosses, even under a conservative definition, into a formal act of war. And I think at that point, you would see a kind of retaliation that is far different than what we've seen up to this point. There is legislation that is pending, and I would encourage everyone to learn more about it. It has co-sponsors on both the Republican and Democratic side, which basically says if some nation state interferes in our election, these penalties will automatically occur. And they are horrific. They will take down another economy. And they may not be taken back out of the system, so a president cannot basically withdraw them by being elected, unless there are a number of elections after, I believe it's 2, that are formally certified independently to not have had any manipulation. I'd like to see that signed into law, because it takes some of the structural incentives that might be created between a head of state and another head of state out of the equation by not giving the head of state the capacity to override that set of actions if they were to occur. So I think there are other things that we can do and ought to do. Third, and quickly, the United States has cyber capacities that are not publicly being discussed that I believe it did exercise in 2018. Some of you are in that community. I believe it's plausible to say we did hack back in 2018. That is, we, the current administration, in some capacity, hacked back and specifically signaled to the Russians a capacity to do great damage if there were additional interference of specific kinds.
There's a question here. Actually, what we're going to do right behind you, Bob, is Peter?
Peter Iber from Camden. Assign it to whoever you want. If I remember correctly, the first thing printed on the Gutenberg press was the Bible. What is the role and the impacts on religion of this media revolution?
Religion. All right, so Lydia, brave Lydia.
I'm not going to talk about religion. I'm just going to remind everyone who founded Facebook and why. How many people did watch the movie about Facebook, creation of Facebook? Okay, there was this kid at university that was a nerd, that girls would not pay attention to him and would not have sex with him. And he created this program at the beginning, and then he began learning more and more about technology until he ended up creating Facebook with two other guys who he betrayed, by the way, and stole their rights. But he created Facebook to demise women at the university. He created to accuse them of things that they did not do, to bully them into paying attention to him and his friends. He used it to accuse them of sexual misbehavior. He accused them of things that are unthinkable. I mean, the movie doesn't portray the truth of what he did, but most of the women that were there at the university do remember what he did. So remembering who founded, the first, who printed the first Bible or the first document back then, and now remembering who created the first platform and what purpose he used it for, and why he has no ethics at all when it comes to reacting to everything that is happening. You just have to remember that. Who is he? And why did he create Facebook?
Let me, Nico, go.
I'll add, I think it's not necessarily clear what the effect of this technology is on religion, but I think there is a growing body of evidence that the technology encourage it, or it, not always, but can be used to encourage a kind of extremism. And it's not just a political extremism, it can be a religious extremism. Now that's true of many media technologies, right? I don't think that's necessarily a new thing, but the scale, scope, and reach of it is significant. And there's this old nerd saying, Godwin's law, that in any online discussion, given enough time, someone will be compared to Hitler. And it holds up under some research. I mean, I think, I don't want to be, the internet has been the best thing that's ever happened to me personally and professionally, and it remains, given some of my obscure and strange interests, a beautiful and necessary part of my life. But I think we just have to be aware of some of the challenges it introduces and the ways it can manipulate our experience and lead us down various paths.
Can I respond on the religion end? Starting in 2000, when technology really took off, right? In Indonesia, which was the world's largest Muslim population, we began reporting that, I was with CNN at that point, we began reporting that more women, for example, were wearing the jilbab. Indonesia was one of the most, like Turkey at that point, was one of the most modern and it's Muslim nations, and it's a democratic nation. So what was interesting is that as they felt more out of control of what is going on, as things moved out of what people were expecting, they moved towards greater protection. These were the women, and I used to ask the women, why would you wear a jilbab? Because I'm a Western woman, and I thought it was constrictive. And the responses I would get is that in many ways, our men respect us more. It allows us to think. So I think one impact of it is things come at you so fast now that the old world of expectations have been shifted. And I would say that with the shift from Excel to big data, the difference in scale changes everything. And I think what we've seen in the Philippines is Asia's largest Roman Catholic nation, that the Catholic Church has weakened significantly, like most institutions. I think Nico said this. But what happened is other evangelical churches came in, and now we're still in search of something, and it is, whether you call it religion or values or purpose, there's a search. And sometimes dictators-to-be replace that with nostalgia for someone else who can make decisions for you in a very complex world.
I wanted to add something, because I was just thinking a little more about what Lydia said, and I think one of the kinds of extremism that's encouraged on the internet is actually, it can be very difficult to see, which is misogyny and sexism. And I think it's, I'll give you two quick stories. One is, David Fahrenthold, the Washington Post reporter, has gotten a lot of attention for the way he uses social media to help his investigative reporting. For example, he says, well, in the Trump Foundation records, it shows they purchased this portrait. Can anyone help me find it? And it turns out the portrait's hanging in one of his golf clubs, not exactly a philanthropic contribution. But most of the women reporters I talked to said they could never use Twitter like that, given the volume of harassment they face online. And I think there is something remarkably toxic about internet culture as it relates to women, and it can be enormously challenging. I think one of the things we don't really discuss or report on is, in fact, the role of pornography, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of a third of internet traffic. And I think it might be the largest cultural force in America that really isn't covered or reported on. And it has a dramatic impact on the trafficking of women, on violence against women, and on the harassment of women online. And I'll note that the digital platforms don't appear to take this very seriously. There are some very simple things they could do, tools they could provide to both to women and to journalists to help them manage the harassment they might face online, and it's just not a priority.
Before we go to the satellite location, we have a question from a gentleman named Bob in the front.
Hi, Bob Hirsch from Owl's Head, Maine, for Nick. Newspaper issue. We all knew newspapers were in decline, but seeing the data made it really dramatic, particularly given their importance as sources. One thing people may not realize was the impact on Maine. We've had 6 paper mills shut down, 5,000 jobs totally vanished, 6 towns devastated. So my question is there any hope of any kind of resurgence of newspapers, perhaps with a new model? It's not clear that the spike in circulation of the Times and the Post will hold after Trump is gone. So do you see any evidence of something happening there that might bring it back?
So is the newspaper going to come back? No, but I don't think it's going to go away completely either. I mean, I think people will still. What's really interesting from our research is that the media that people grew up with, people still go out and buy. I still buy a daily newspaper, and probably many of us in the room do that as well. But we also use these other forms of media as well. I think what's interesting is you're actually seeing some digital-born companies, like we have one in the UK called Tortoise Media, I mentioned it yesterday, who now produce a book, actually. It's not a newspaper, but once a month they put all their writing into a printed thing and it gives it to all the members. So again, it comes back to this thing, it's not really an either-or, it's this sort of and world. You now need to produce this content, dreadful word, this journalism, and package it in different ways. So I think there will still be newspapers, and what you see in the US is kind of an extreme case, but we're seeing it in other parts of the world as well. I mean, local news in the UK is under enormous strain, job losses, closures, and unlike other forms of media, like, I think we're now seeing quality press has got some route to sustainability. Digital subscriptions, diversified models, people who are interested in news, New York Times and others, they're going to be fine. But the gaps are investigative journalism and local journalism, and we see it not just in the US, but around the world too. And the other thing I would say is I think the other really interesting story to watch over the next few years is going to be the implications of people not watching television news anymore. So yes, older people will continue to do that, but what are the implications? That's been the main way in which people who are less interested in news really get to understand about elections, or they see television debates or whatever. So when that becomes less important because people are not being hammered from a entertainment show into the evening newscast, what are the implications for that?
Kathleen I'll get back to you. Nico, go ahead.
No.
So Kathleen, what I was going to say is, remember, what did Robert McChesney once say about this? He had this concept. The same way that we check off on our taxes $3 to contribute to public contributions to campaigns, we should have a checkoff box for the media. And I know Jeff's like, though we have to approve which media gets the money.
2 words, Donald Trump.
I'm just looking for the money, man. I'm just looking for the money.
It'll come at a price.
You guys don't like that.
I'm actually looking for a nonprofit journalism model. We should never have given the spectrum away. There should have been a channel 24 hours a day that was open for high quality journalism. That was basically done in the middle of the night, I believe in the 1990s. The factcheck.org is the nonprofit journalism model. Universities are equipped to offer more nonprofit journalism. The question is, where else can we find nonprofit journalism space? Center for Public Integrity is nonprofit journalism and has produced really important work across time. So I grant that we need to find alternative models and we need to find other ways to fund, but we should also look to the nonprofit community in order to find ways to sustain quality journalism.
Nico, quick follow-up.
On that, there's a number. I keep meaning to figure out the exact number of U.S. state capitals where the largest newsroom covering the state capital is a university newsroom. I also want to note that there are lots of potential ways of helping the news industry. Early in the history of newspapers, the newspaper industry basically was subsidized by the U.S. Postal Service in a sense for how they calculated the postage on these things. I do want to go back to one thing Bob said. I just want to contrast, yes, there have been the paper mill closings, but I wonder how many server farms may have opened in Maine. And what that may have done to some of these communities, maybe none, but everything we do online actually requires physicality, right? It requires servers and bandwidth, and that has economic impact. And server farms really need 2 things: they need cheap power and they need cold weather because they generate so much heat, and keeping them cold is a challenge. And so I just, for what is lost, there's always something gained as well.
We have a question from a remote location. Belfast, Maine. Since there's not enough time to think and digest the flood of information, is individual thought doomed?
Yes.
Well, I mean, if you're it's not a silly question because, how much time do you spend glued to silliness on your cell phone and you're not thinking? Was it Jeff? Did you raise your hand?
It's the opposite.
Yeah?
Finally, we're not, I'm going to say it again, in a mass where we're presumed to all be the same, given the same stuff, expected to digest it and say how wonderful it is and pay for it. Now, finally, we can have our own thoughts and our own voices and our own perspective. And so finally, we are free of the tyranny of mass media. And we can be individuals and be seen as individuals and act as individuals.
But there's not some bread and circuses part of this, that what's on our phone is a distraction from the deeper thoughts?
I'll go up against Jeff because I love him so much. I love him so much. So for me, take a look at the impact on us and our kids right now. Our attention span has narrowed. It used to be when I was with CNN, they said, you have to take the first 30 seconds, then it became 10 seconds, and now you have the attention span of a goldfish, which is 3 seconds, right? So it's like...
That's an attentive goldfish.
Yeah. So,
should meet my puppy.
I think that's the first, is the impact of this stuff on our own brains. It is literally rewiring our brains, and it is playing with our emotions. It's designed that way. You have increased dopamine when you're on Facebook. You have increased oxytocin. So then the next part of that is, yes, we have our individual realities, but man and woman are social animals, and we still need a public sphere. So what happens if I decide my reality is more important than your reality or your reality? In the old days, I could go to an insane asylum because I don't fit in. Where are these new boundaries? And big fan of Jeff.
And she is my hero. Let's be clear here.
So we had an initiative from our new dean at NYU. It's called Minds and Machines, and he wants to get people thinking about if they have overlapping research interests. And for the first event, they did these lightning talks where they let people come up and talk about their research for 3 minutes. And there was a classics professor whose name I do not remember, but I want to give a shout out to her, who came up and basically read us critiques from ancient Greece about what was going to happen to the state of human knowledge now that we had writing. And the criticisms were, how can you divorce the thought from the person? That when there's writing, you could read the words without the person there, and this was going to destroy everything, and it was going to put all the people whose job it was to sit around reciting poetry out loud for other people out of business.
Hey!
That's a problem. Right, Nico? That's a problem.
So, and I believe it was Homer making these problems. So I think from the dawn of time, every time, so I kept thinking about, could I work this in after Jeff was talking about everything people said that was wrong about the printing press, right? I just thought this was fantastic when I heard it. It's not my research, I'm just repeating it from someone else. But I do think there is, so in the question of how can we process new information, I think it's a legitimate question, and the questions that Maria is raising about, I'm very interested in kind of neuropsych research about how these things are rewiring our brains, how we process information. But I sit there with my son, my 13-year-old son, and it was like, let's watch it, let's play a video game together. And then he's watching a movie on the side while he's playing it, and he's watching someone, and I'm like, why are you doing this? But then you see this research that actually, this is really good for fighter pilots if you want to be a fighter pilot, to be able to pay attention to different things and stuff. So I think this is a lifelong thing, and I think if you go back in time, television was going to ruin everything, radio was going to ruin everything, the printing press, and it turns out writing was going to ruin everything when people started to put stuff down so that you could do it. So I think we are remarkably adaptive, but, and this is my recurring theme, it's an important issue for study, because if we are now going to consume news in different ways, right, we want to understand what the implications of that is. And if people are really only reading headlines and aren't reading full news stories, we want to understand what the implications of that are for how they think about politics, for how they process information. The good news is there's lots of people doing really interesting research in this regard. And so the big plug again for basic scientific research, because it will allow us to kind of get a handle on some of these questions.
Yeah.
Just real quickly, I want to recommend a book to you since you actually read, called How History Gets Things Wrong, the Neuroscience of Our Addiction to Stories by Alex Rosenberg. I think if I'm wrong, please someone Google it and tell me if I'm wrong. In which he argues that the theory of mind that says we have thoughts and desires leading to an action is a myth. It's what journalism is based on, the law is based on, drama and fiction are based on. BS. Neuroscience says that instead we basically play videotapes in our head and say, yeah, that one. I've done that before, I'll do that again. If you look at the behavior of, let's say, addicts, it points that way. So this is why I'm dying for the neuroscience kind of research that Josh is talking about. And I don't necessarily, by the way, Maria, again, is my hero. But we can disagree, and that's what makes the world great. I'm not sure it's rewiring us, but I think it's bringing out different ways that we think that we're not used to figuring out yet. And so we need to pull in these other disciplines and understand human thought before we imagine and design these systems, which may be manipulative, that maybe the new version of news is propaganda again. But but that's kind of, how do we convince people that they're all wrong? You know, that's kind of propaganda, but for the good guys. So how do we draw those lines? How do we figure this out? It's a very complex question.
Can I just add, I think there's also, sorry.
Well, I mean, just directly in response to Jeff, another book to recommend, which I think maybe the question is a little bit wrong. It's not about the information overload. It's about how the information is created. And again, you heard Maria Ressa mention Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's one of the most important books I've ever read in my life. And I think it's very important because the idea inherent in the question is that it's about having too much information and we just can't think. I think the challenge, which I agree with Shoshana's analysis, is that the data that is being used to give us information and to create our choice preferences, to create the environment in which we are even able to make choices, is increasingly about predicting and then and compelling us to have certain choices. So, now it's about making recommendations as you walk down the street, you pass a store and all of a sudden you get a coupon for something. Our technologies are increasingly leading us in a specific direction. So I think the challenge for individual thought is how, if we're getting all of our information through data-driven, machine learning, algorithmically created information systems, how can we have individual thought and even know that we're having individual thought?
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, I was just going to raise, I think there's a generational issue here, and we did some research last year where we looked at under 35s and we tracked what they were doing on their mobile phones. We talked to them individually about what they were doing. We also talked to their friends about how they got their news. And what was really fascinating about that was that sort of, on the one hand, that amazing level of multitasking. So, we found people who were playing video games and listening to a podcast at the same time, right? I couldn't do that. My brain doesn't work in that way. So, younger people seem to be, who've grown up with digital, right? They're going to be handling that information overload in different ways. And in fact, they didn't talk about information overload. The other thing that was really interesting was that, the stereotype is that young people, have attention spans of a goldfish. What we found was they also were setting, so yes, through the day, they are picking up stuff from Instagram and they're picking up all these headlines. They're hugely knowledgeable about what's happening on the surface, but some of them, not all of them, also have these dedicated times for news. So that they're sort of, and it won't be the same times. It might be late at night. It might be, they actually sit down and read a newspaper at the weekend. Probably not a real physical one, but digitally. And that was absolutely fascinating. Or they would listen to a podcast at a particular time, going back to this idea of sort of linear and finished. So it's not an either or. There is a lot of snacking going on, but then for some people, you've also got that sort of real deep interest and passion for particular subjects. And I think it's back to this, how do we think about media and the formats we're creating so that it fits into people's lives and provides hooks, but also meaning.
So that game you play about if you could invite anybody to your dinner party, who would you invite? I mean, this is what you invite. You invite this group of people. Anyone in history, it would be this group of people. Question from the Camden balcony. Tell us your name and direct your question to one of our panelists, please.
Hi, Hank Thayer, Weathersfield, Connecticut. And my question is, the other day, I think it was Nico Mille, and if it wasn't you, I apologize, but somebody stated that the First Amendment is obsolete. I respectfully but vigorously disagree, and I have to ask, if the First Amendment's obsolete, what takes its place?
Mille, it was you.
Yes. For the sake of argument, the jurisprudence around the First Amendment is based on this idea that that speech is scarce, and because speech is scarce, we must protect it. But the reality today is speech is not scarce at all, and that in fact you can flood the zone with junk, with distraction, with lies, and truth will not survive. And so when I say the First Amendment is obsolete, I'm stealing that from an essay by Tim Wu. I highly recommend. He makes a much more erudite case than I do. But I'm trying to provoke us into thinking about the way we think about speech. Speech was protected because it was hard to get a printing press and print. That's not hard anymore. What's hard is actually figuring out what's true, figuring out what's healthy, what's good. That's not what the First Amendment is about. I'm not saying we should do away with it. I'm just saying it doesn't solve the problems we're facing.
Anybody else?
Right, I gotta.
Yeah. Bring it on.
All right. So first Jeff, and then Kathleen.
No, Kathleen first.
No, Jeff first. The thing the First Amendment is about for me is that government is scary.
Yeah.
Government shall make no law.
Yeah.
The accumulated power is scary. The inequities created when power is in one place and individuals are in another place.
Yeah.
And it can be abused. And if we lose track of that notion and we stop protecting that notion and protecting speech from all things that look like that, then I think we give up a founding principle that helps sustain a system of accountability.
What scares me about Nico's direction is what I've seen in some academics I respect have started writing papers speculating about whether there is, and I quote, too much speech. That frightens me to death. I'm not saying I'm not putting those words in Nico's mouth, but it's a logical extension. And this question of abundance of speech, too much speech. If you ever say there's too much speech, then who decides is over the line? Who decides what's too much? Who doesn't value this individual versus that individual? That's up to each individual one of us to do, to decide whom we listen to and whom we ignore. The thing we've got to probably learn to do as a society is to ignore more.
Fascinating. We had a question from a different part of the world. Rockland. As a journalist, if you later learn one of your reports is false or biased, how do you correct it? For those of us journalists here, Jason, have you ever been wrong?
I've never been wrong. and that's even better now that I'm an opinions columnist. So I will, but I'll say that now that I've switched over from doing hard news to opinions, you don't have the same kind of fact-checking and editing safety nets as you do when you're doing hard news. So for me personally, it feels like a much more monumental responsibility now to get things right, because previously I had the staff of several different departments working with me on every single piece. That being said, I mean, I think there's such a rush, the priority now is getting things out fast more than getting them out right, and I don't think corrections work the same way that they used to, and they get buried in so much other content. So just speaking for myself, I'm extremely careful, and if I get something wrong, I'm more than happy to own it publicly. Fortunately, that doesn't happen very often.
Courtney, you're advocate now, but you are a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about false. I think it's usually like it was not accurate, and you would attach a correction, and you will do that by adding a note at the bottom. I am a print journalist. Add a note at the bottom of the article. I have to say, like, when I worked at the New York Times, like, everyone's greatest fear was having to get a correction, and you want that among journalists, right? And at CPJ, sometimes, we're reporting that this number of journalists was killed in an attack, and we've tried to verify everything, but we're also trying to, with the facts that we have, and then it turns out maybe somebody survived a, wound in the hospital or whatever, we'll attach a correction. But the problem is that only works on the article. It doesn't correct the tweet that went out, it doesn't correct the Facebook post, it doesn't then, get into the ecosystem.
Lydia, you get attacked for being wrong, but you're right a lot. But how do you feel about when occasionally there's something that you'd like to correct the record on?
Well, I would like to differentiate between giving an opinion, like an opinion article in which you might be wrong. A lot of people are wrong about things when they write opinions or whatever. And I think if you are a journalist, I mean, in general, if you're a decent human being, you should recognize you made a mistake. But if you're a journalist, you must do it because it's the ethical thing to do. But then on the other hand, as a journalist, or speaking as an investigative reporter, I have never, ever lied or being, wrong about any of my investigative reports. Because what I do is I fact check, I go back to my sources. I am very aware not to be induced by anyone to write anything, because this is something that happens to journalists, and almost no one talks about it outside our world, which is when you become sort of famous or someone notices you because you are on TV. Politicians and influencers and people that have a lot of power, even minors or people that work owners of mines, not minors. They are calling journalists constantly to have lunch or dinner, breakfast, whatever, and talk to them about issues. So they induce them to talk about certain issues. And a lot of journalists in the US and in Mexico and everywhere around the world do it all the time because it fits their ego. And that is absolutely wrong, that is unethical, and they shouldn't do it. Then the other thing I wanted to say was when I wrote my book, Slavery Inc., my publisher in the US was reading the translation that, by the way, I asked a friend, a lawyer, to review it just for the American laws because, I have some experience in being in jail because of my books. And the publisher called me and she said, listen, Lydia, we are quite worried because, in the US, we journalists do double fact-checking. And I said, you shouldn't be worried because in Mexico we do triple fact-checking because not only our lives are in danger, but also our credibility is so important to us. And the credibility and the respect for anyone that reads our books is more important than anything else. So you go back to that. It's ethics. That's all.
But it's also inherent in journalism. If you're doing journalism, you will self-correct. And Kathleen said that earlier. One thing about bias, at CPJ, we're just reporting facts. We don't have any opinion journalists. But it can look biased if you say report on some negative law and a journalist is angry about that and we're reporting about this. We always try to get the government official or the agency implicated. A lot of times they won't return our call. We'll say, we tried to get a hold of this agency or this official on WhatsApp, on email, da-da-da-da-da. And if they call us back after the story goes to publication, we'll amend, again, it's not a correction, but we'll amend a note and update and say, we updated this to reflect that. And I think that's one way you can deal with what you might consider bias.
I'm still reeling from Kathleen's presentation this morning. And in the context of this conversation, I wonder if ABC and Fox and all of those clips you showed, if they need to issue a correction on their coverage of the 2016 presidential race.
They should.
Here's the thing. I'm nostalgic for the earlier days of my career when there was no web and I was a broadcaster, hadn't done my print stuff yet, and you'd say something and it might be wrong, and then there'd be no record of that. And someone said, did you say that? And you go, did you hear that? I don't think I quite said it that way. And you just kind of moved on. We work really hard to try to be right, and I'll be wrong a couple times this week. It's horrible. I live in fear of being wrong, but we work at it and try to correct. Question up here in the Camden Opera House balcony. Sir, your name?
Thank you. I'm Darrell Abavisi. We're from Salem, Massachusetts, but our sailboat lives here in Rockport.
Nice.
So yesterday, Maria posited two principles to improve the responsibility of the web. One was that you own your data, and the other is that it has to be managed in a way that it's portable. So my question is primarily for Jeff and maybe for Nick and others. What do you think?
Yeah, interesting. In other words, that proposal about owning your data, do you think it'll help some of the stuff we're talking
about? The problem with this concept of my data is much more complex than that, right? If I take a picture right now with Maria and I put it up, does she have the right to tell me to take the picture that I took of me down? Because it's her data. Isn't it also my data? If I buy something from Amazon, Amazon is part of that transaction and has a right to know that. And so I think that this notion of ownership is problematic. And then, so the question I would say is different. What permissions do you have? What rights do you have? There's other ways to look at that question, I think. But I think that and I further get nervous as I do when Nico says things that I want to disagree with, right? The same way I'll get nervous here is that when people talk about trying to control data and data becomes a scare word, then ultimately knowledge becomes a scare word. So it's part of what Josh was trying to say too yesterday, or said very well yesterday, was that if we shut down all this data because we're scared of data and scared of what it entails, we also potentially shut down knowledge that comes from it. And that worries me. So Dana Boyd, who I mentioned yesterday at Data and Society, taught me the basic lesson about data is that we should control not its gathering, but its use. And if I sit down for a job interview with you, you know, because I have white hair that I used to argue was prematurely white, that I'm an old fart, and you can tell other things about me, but you can't legally discriminate against me for the job because I'm old. You may do it, but the pattern that may come out may get you in the end that you did that. But except in the movie Men in Black, there's no pen that allows you to erase knowledge. But we have, I think, in regulation and legislation and in the dialogue about data, this idea that we can erase knowledge. And once again, I'm going to go back to saying that for anyone to say that you should not know things is a concept that on its face scares me. So saying, I own this data and you may not, is tantamount in the long run to that. So let's have a discussion instead about what our relationship is, what our permissions are, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, in my name or not. Let's have discussions about transparency. What are you gathering and why? We screwed it up royally in the media, advertising, and technology businesses with the cookie. Mm-hmm. The simple little cookie is necessary for the operation of the web. It has been demonized by the likes of the Wall Street Journal, what they know about you, the cookie, because we were not transparent about why we were doing this and what you were getting out of it and what control you had over it and what control you didn't have over it. And so we deserved it.
But also because it was abused, too.
Yeah, right. But the problem there wasn't the cookie. The problem there wasn't the knowledge. The problem there was the use of the knowledge. And that's a very different discussion, I think.
Kathleen, and then we'll go to Nico.
The problem is it's called a cookie.
Because it was created by guys.
But I worry when people talk about our data, your data, because I don't think that's what's being sold. I think what's being sold is our privacy and our identity. And I think when you frame it that way, you talk about it differently. And I think of data as being an externalized thing in ways that actually we're robbing it of some meaning by virtue of making these things our data. Because I don't object to the data. I object to them taking my identity, my privacy, and using it in order to try to manipulate me.
Yeah.
My big problem is actually data, what I would say is data asymmetry. I can't get out of Netflix the number of shows I've watched. I can't get, do I mostly watch crap or do I mostly watch things that are good for me? I can't, there's no like, I can't get, recently from Uber, I was trying to figure out how many rides have I taken in my entire lifetime using Uber and what average price have I paid per mile and is it different in different cities? I wanted to know how often do I tip drivers and what do I can't, I get none of that. I got nothing. You know, there's real data asymmetry and the problem in my mind is less about ownership because I agree with Jeff that there's some complicated issues to work through there, but more about that kind of asymmetry, which I think leads to the consolidation of power and you know, my regular theme, power corrupts, and we must hold power accountable, and the data asymmetry is a form of power. I want to, however, dispute or disagree with Jeff on one thing.
I'm glad
which is, you know, on data collection. There's just a huge amount of data collected that's unnecessary and irrelevant. An early, they don't do this anymore, but an early version of the New York Times app on your phone collected the numbers you were calling. Like, why in God's name do they need that? And one of the things I like about the GDPR law that passed in Europe is they said you can only collect data that you have a legitimate use for. Well, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. The idea that all these companies are out there collecting data in an asymmetrical way because they think maybe one day they'll figure out how to use it to make money, that's not okay.
What if they'll figure out how to use it to save your life? This became an issue in the UK with health data, that when it was collected, they didn't know that it might have information value on kidney diseases. And so its use was later forbidden because that wasn't transparent at the beginning. It's knowledge. And so we're not going to, I agree with you, absolutely. New York Times collecting phone numbers is absurd, and they should be, and the answer to that is to be transparent about what they're collecting so you can know and so you can screech like a stuck pig, as one should. But to worry that, to think that we can know all future uses of data and knowledge is absurd.
But I'll debate Jeff again on this. I think that to then give a pass to these huge giants who have learned to monetize our privacy, and are now able with technology to know us far more intimately than our most intimate relationships. So when I say data portability, I just want that asymmetric relationship. I want to have a little more power in that relationship so that these platforms take care of us, right? And I'll do one more solution, which is in Chris Wiley's book on Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. What he said is, this is longer term. The reason why I like data portability is because in this right now, in the short term, if we had to come up with a law, I created my data on Facebook. I'm gonna sit there and it's portable out. I can close my Facebook down. But if I can take that and then help create a new social media platform that is going to be far kinder to the users and will protect us, I'll do that. But I have no choice right now, and I do not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's one. Chris Wiley said, this is more medium term. He said another solution that you can have is to require building codes for coders. So it is personal in nature. The company can't tell him or her what to do. Look, the tech people always say, it's very complicated. It isn't so complicated. We have worked with far more complicated businesses all around the world. You don't get on a plane and have to sign that you are okay if the plane crashes. You know, somebody regulated this. You don't take medicine that hasn't been tested. We've done this for other industries, and it's time to actually demand that this whole idea of information is power, that now we need to do something to protect us.
Okay, there's a question, thank you, in the back of the hall. Tell us your name.
My name is Louisa Boatwright. I'm from Newport, Rhode Island, and I am a woman. I just want to start there. The internet, to me, we have learned a lot. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this very much. The internet, in my opinion, is not speech. And Maria, you just did start this conversation, which is my question, which is it's algorithms, as you have all explained to us. So the infrastructure that has been created by private entities, and then they wrap their algorithms around it, creates, as you've all told us, pornography and against women and sexism and hate overrides love always in media. How could it be restructured, and where does it need to start to change the algorithms to be more fair?
Do you have someone particular you were interested in? Was it?
Well, since Maria just started it, but then I think...
Yeah, we've done some coverage on the air. The IEEE, which is the Association for Engineers and Electronics People, they've come up with a standard. When designing algorithms, they would like people to embrace, they can't make them, in which there's transparency with algorithms. There's always bias in all algorithms. Well, what are they as far as the engineers are concerned? Sometimes it's just engineers in a room going, yeah, I'll use that bias, that sounds a good idea to me. And there's that movement, but I think the panel, maybe Maria, you could start, there's probably other efforts.
So there's a film also out in Sundance called Coded Bias, where this woman in Stanford, she's a black woman, and she couldn't do the assignment on artificial intelligence because the machine couldn't read her face. So the only way that she could do it is if she literally put a white face on. And that's what the film is about, coded bias. So these are the things we code into the algorithms. There's another great book on math, oh my gosh.
Weapons of Math
Destruction, where it uses, so think again what algorithms do. We get a ton of data. We look for the patterns in the data, and then you write an algorithm for a particular purpose. The first instance in the Weapons of Math Destruction is how it was used for an educational system in this town, and it actually brought out the wrong things. So I guess the other part is this is a time of trial and error, and transparency really would be an incredible thing to do, which is something you can learn from journalism. Like, we don't know all the answers, and it's extremely humbling always to realize that you never want to be wrong, so you have the humility to say it's better to be transparent than it is to try to look like you know what everything you're talking about. So that's the second one. And then the third one, I think, is it's going to get worse, right? Because technology will take off. And I think that not enough of us, I always think of the world in two different ways, old power and new power. Old power doesn't have to do with age, but old power are the ones like the traditional news groups. We had power, old power, governments, and then new power are the tech people who fundamentally deal with the world differently because they atomize the world in order to build it, but old power starts with values and systems. So it's and the same with journalism, right? So it's almost trying to shift the world to help our coders, our tech people to have that same thing. You can't atomize meaning. So what does that look like? Sorry, it's a good time and this is how I'll end it, I think this is a time when empower yourself. Look at all the stuff. This is only the beginning. This is a time, I said this, it's creative destruction. Be part of it. Weapons of Math Destruction is a woman who really looked at this, the impact on her world, and then moved forward. Each one of us is empowered to do this, so fix your world.
Thank you. Josh Tucker?
Yeah, so I want to combine kind of an answer with this question with the discussion we were having on the last question about data portability as well. And just to stress the point that I made yesterday, we're not going to know the answers to these questions that you are asking right now if the data that is collected by all of these companies is contained inside all these companies, and we are only going to learn what those companies have learned from that data if they themselves choose to publicly release that data. So I want to put just a couple ideas in your head to sort of think about this, about ways we can, so to answer your question, we are going to have to know what's happening before we can know what's problematic and before we can know how these things could be fixed. So just a couple of sort of more radical ideas to think about here in terms of the way we think about data and the way we think about the environment we're in now, where all this information is being provided voluntarily by individuals to this small number of companies, right, that they then use and they put on these platforms that people very much enjoy using. So two ideas. One is to think about the idea of taxation, right? We live in a world where companies know they don't get to keep all of the profits they make. The reason they don't get to keep all the profits they make is because they know they couldn't make any money if there wasn't somebody building roads to their company, if there wasn't somebody with courts to protect their intellectual property, if there wasn't someone paying for an armed services to make sure that people with guns didn't just come in and take over their campuses and their factories. So companies give back some of their profits to the state, and the state provides these things that companies and the economy needs to flourish. What if we think about data that way, right? That if we begin to think about that companies who are collecting tons and tons of data about individuals have an obligation to return some of that data into the public domain so that it can be used to inform questions of public policy, so it can be used to advance science, so it can be used to, again, yes, hold the companies themselves accountable, right? So we might begin to, and obviously this is impractical for a startup, but these are things that can be fixed. But if you get above a certain size, right, some of that data that you're using to optimize your product that you're providing, that has to be made available to society, right? Another way of thinking about this, an even more radical way of thinking about this, is the way we think about patents, right? When people have an idea in a capitalist society, we reward that idea and say, yes, you get to make profit off of that idea. Well, what if we think about data in that regard, too? You build a platform, you're Facebook, you build this thing that everybody wants to use. That's great. You get all this data that you can use to optimize your product, to increase your profits, but you don't get it forever. You get it for a period of time. You get a portion where you get exclusive access to this, but afterwards, that data has to be made available to society in some ways. And so the final thing I would just think about, I mean, these are sort of bigger picture things to think about, ways to conceptualize and wrap your head around what's going on here. But when we talk about data portability, which is a big idea that people are talking about right now, I think exactly what Maria's saying, allowing for competition to flourish is important. So you could port your data to another company. But you should also think about data portability as a way to donate your data to science. People do this all the time. People donate the processing power on their computers to be able to fold proteins and help scientists figure out ways to come up with new advanced therapies for disease. Well, we might want to think about baking into our policy prescriptions here, when people can do data portability, is there an easy way to donate your data to science? Now, people will have to trust the scientists. Yeah. They'll have to trust that the data will be taken securely. But there are a lot of us who are working really hard on trying to come up with methods to do these things that will instill these levels of trust, people doing incredible research in this way. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
So I'm going to get to Courtney in just a sec, but Lydia had her hand up first. Courtney, I won't forget you. Lydia?
Yes, I want to answer your question as a woman. There are a lot of things you can actually do, because behind every algorithm is a human being. And I will give you two examples of what has happened when people get involved in this as activists in the internet. One of them was Instagram and Facebook started taking down profiles of women that were doing this amazing campaign all over Latin America for breastfeeding. And they took down their profiles because not the breasts showed, because the breasts are okay, you know, pornography and all that, that's okay. But the nipples were showing, and babies were stuck to the nipples. So they made this campaign, and they took all these profiles of all these great activists. So we all created a campaign. I wrote about it, and then a lot of people created a campaign, and we just made it huge. And to address Facebook and Instagram for that, and reminding them that they were not taking down profiles of people who were, sharing child pornography, for example. And what happened was that people from Facebook invited some of us to go and talk to the tech guys, to the young men that were doing these algorithms. And by the end, I talked to one of them, and I said, "Are you the nipple guy because you were shot? I mean, you didn't talk." All of that. He was like, "Yeah, I am." And I'm like, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Well, because I think, breastfeeding sucks. It's awful. It's ugly." And I said, "Do you like breasts? I mean, do you like, girls in bikinis and stuff like that?" And he said, "Yeah, I love them." And I said, "Okay, listen, they do have nipples." And anyway, this sounds like a joke, but it's so important because eventually what happened was that Facebook created this think tank in which they included, at least in Latin America, feminists. I mean, I'm in that. And we are insisting on them to clarify in some policies that they're doing all the time, in which they're creating this kind of algorithms. And the second part was in the US, was a long time ago when the hackers had got together to tackle child pornography. I had a conference here in the US, and I talked about how Facebook was taking down the profiles of child pornography that was announced in Mexico and Brazil, which are the two countries that use Facebook the most. And in the US, because of the Megan law, they are not, because US government doesn't allow them to take them down. What allows them to do is just to keep them and give them to the police or to authorities. So they follow the case of child pornography. And when I said this, Facebook sent a lawyer to the conference next day, and a journalist interviewed me, and Facebook sent a lawyer, and they said they were going to sue me because I was lying. And then I talked to the journalist, and I explained the whole thing, and I brought evidence of it all. And then, to make a long story short, they ended up asking me to go work for Facebook. And I, of course, did not agree. But what happened is that now they do face recognition when it comes to children in child pornography in Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And now what they do is they save it for the authorities to do something about it, because half of the kids are from other countries, maybe Americans in Mexico or Brazil, whatever. So it can change if you do activism, and that goes for all the young people up there that we're asking at the beginning.
Courtney, thanks for your presentation.
Sure. So just a couple of things. On algorithmic transparency, knowing what are the assumptions, what are the decisions being made is very important, because the platforms, for example, Facebook, the assumption underlying the recommendation algorithm, or on YouTube, is that you should get more of what you like, and that can lead to, for example, extremism. But it's also important to look at the data and the data sets that are being used to train that algorithm, because that also needs opening up. We've all heard about the bias in many of the data sets that are used to train machine learning. Second of all, we should be thinking about doing human rights assessments of some of these new products that are being used. This is an idea that's gaining currency, and the companies do this for some things. They do consultations about we're thinking about this new policy or this new product, and increasingly think about what are the human rights implications of this algorithm, of this product. third, we have to think about data and what we are datafying, because sure, you could turn it into knowledge, but I think we have to ask, should we be datafying all of this information, and what is ours, what is someone else's? They can now see where you're looking on a computer screen to see what words or images, what are they going to do with that? Your heartbeat, all of this, and putting them into data sets. And let's be clear, we've been talking about only the first level of data brokers, right? But there are entire industries that we don't even see that are data brokers, third-party data brokers selling our data in packages. If you have not read it, Charlie Warzel's piece, several pieces in the New York Times Sunday edition, looking at a data set of geolocation data that they got from a third party, from a worker who was so concerned about that data, they were able to trace back and find from this so-called anonymized data where all these people lived, including White House officials, police officers, reporters. So, it's a lot more complicated.
Okay, we have room for 2 quickies, and a very patient person here. Tell us your name.
Yeah, thanks. Ron Bancroft, Cumberland, Maine. So it's very powerful what we've heard, and it's scary. It's scary to see some of the potential for abuse and how it's played out. And it's hard to see how people fight back. I mean, we see a little of it with Maria and what you've done, incredible. But
and Lydia.
And Lydia too. But how do we fight back? So I don't take any big messages out of here about how we fight back. And so I'd like Nico to recite the Darkling Thrush again, because that gave me hope. That gave me hope.
What piece of it do you want to share?
How about, if you're going to do 2 questions, I'll recite a poem at the end. How about that?
Okay, that sounds cool. And there's a question up here. It's going to be the last question.
Hi, my name is Frank Kelly. I'm from Ashland, Maine. I'm here with the University of Maine, Orono. My question's for Nico specifically. Earlier you mentioned the physical requirements associated with computing as we approach the physical limitations of traditional portable computing, and quantum computing seems to be over the horizon still. Do you foresee an eye of the hurricane moment where maybe my generation, can reevaluate and strengthen our institutions? And if so, which institutions give you the most trouble?
So a technological pause where we can regroup.
I don't think we're anywhere near actually the limitations of computing power. Just think about what's happened with Alexa and voice activate, and the role of voice in computing. I think that it's just going to be woven into our lives with increasing, so that you won't even notice it. In terms of the institutions I'm most concerned about, I'm most concerned about the institutions that hold power accountable, journalism being foremost among them, and to another, and also government and regulation. The real challenge is power, actually, and creating that balance, bringing that accountability to our systems. That's what I'm concerned about with the decline of our institutions. And there is a role technology could play, and frequently does. And Maria's a great example, so is Lydia, of ways technology can help hold power accountable. But we need to really institutionalize it, enshrine it in ways that protect it, because it's so fragile. In Friday night, I recited The Darkling Thrush by Thomas Hardy. And I could recite that again, but I think I'll take my prerogative to recite a different poem for you. This one is by an Irish poet named Eamon Grennan, and it's called Could This Be It? Transfiguration. Consider it from where you stand. Overnight, the cold, cloudy, wet spell has lifted, and you wake beneath a Byzantine blue dome of glass. Golden birds, red hearts in their musical chests, overflow the oak leaves with their echoes, a frenzy of possession that fractures into small squabbles as two red-breasted nuthatches struggle for dominion in a sapling oak, its leaves emerald tesserae in which sunlight glows. Suddenly, the leaves look back at you, looking up at their broad, light-lapping faces. Morning is riding your shoulders like a pet monkey, and all is pause for a cracked moment of amazement, mutuality, and then you walk into the woodshade, flapping the mosquitoes away.
You've been fantastic. We're holding in our thoughts, of course, Indira, who couldn't be with us today because of the loss of her dad. We're also would like James Nakway, who had the flu. Hope he's feeling better. Been thinking about him. Wish he could have been here with us. I studied in Ghana for a semester in West Africa, and I'm a student of proverbs, and I think there's one that's very short that I think is perfect for just now. All they say, what they say in the Akan speakers in Ghana, say one must come out of one's house to begin learning. You came out of your house, I think we learned something. Thank you very much. And thank the panel. Thank you, Jason. That was really fun. Thanks for your patience.